I found her on the balcony, leaning against the cold metal railing, the noise of the party behind her fading into something distant. She had a wine glass in her hand, but her fingers didn't hold it firmly. It was more like a prop to keep her anchored. The lights from the city flickered across her face, highlighting the shadow under her eyes. She didn't smile, didn't even notice I was there at first. "Jacob," she said, almost too softly, "I'm scared of ending up alone." Her words hit me before I could even respond. There was no joke in her tone, no playful attempt at lightening. It was raw, almost fragile, like the sound of glass breaking quietly in an empty room. I didn't move closer right away. I simply leaned against the doorframe, letting my presence be a quiet answer. "You won't," I said finally. My voice was calm, measured, but firm. "I promise that won't happen." She didn't laugh, didn't push back. She just looked at me, as if weighing the truth of my words against her own fears. For a moment, the city seemed to shrink around us. The party, the lights, the noise, all of it fell away. There was just the two of us suspended in that fragile pause. She shifted, wrapping her arms around herself, and I noticed the tension in her shoulders. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't press for more. Instead, I leaned against the railing beside her, letting the silence stretch between us. Sometimes words aren't the answer. Sometimes presence is enough. And in that moment, I wanted her to know that she wasn't standing there alone. "Do you always say that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Say what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "That everything will be okay." I shook my head. "No, I don't say it lightly. I mean it when I say it to you." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw her breathe a little easier, the tension in her chest loosening just enough to notice it. I didn't touch her, didn't reach out. I didn't need to. Trust isn't forced. It's offered, quietly, without conditions, and I wanted her to feel that, if only for a single moment. We stayed there for a while. The music from inside ebbed, but we were apart from it. She spoke eventually, about small things at first, the way the wind felt, the city lights, a joke one of our friends had made, but her voice carried a weight beneath it, a subtle tremor that belied how tightly she held herself together. I listened more than I spoke, and sometimes, that's the beginning of something important. Not a declaration, not a sudden spark, but a shared silence that says, without words, that you are seen, that you are not alone, and that someone has chosen to stand beside you. The night didn't end with fireworks or dramatic gestures. It ended with us, standing quietly on that balcony, two people caught in a small, delicate shift, one word promising a presence, one promise beginning to settle into reality. And for the first time that evening, I sensed that something had started that neither of us could yet name. The next morning, I found myself waiting outside the small cafe on the corner, the one with chipped paint and the smell of roasted beans lingering on the street. Natalie arrived a few minutes later, her hair slightly mussed from sleep and her jacket still hanging loose over her shoulders. She smiled faintly when she saw me, a small curve that didn't demand anything but made the world seem lighter. We sat at a corner table, far from the window and closer to the coffee machine. Steam rose between us, carrying the bitter warmth of espresso. I watched her trace the rim of her cup with a finger, as if testing the reality of being there, in this small, ordinary, with me. "You seemed calm last night," she said, breaking the silence that felt both heavy and necessary. "I wasn't nervous," I asked, leaning back, letting my words carry the weight of honesty rather than charm. "No, you were steady," she said, eyes flicking up to mine. "It's rare. Most people try too hard to fix things." I nodded. "I just listen. That's enough sometimes." She studied me for a moment, then laughed softly, almost embarrassed. "You're not most people," she admitted. There was a pause then, filled only with the low hum of the cafe and the occasional clink of spoons against ceramic. I wanted to say more, but the right words didn't come. Instead, I reached for my cup and let the silence stretch. "I've never done this before," she said finally, her voice quieter, almost confessional. "Trusting someone like this, so quickly. You don't have to rush," I said. "You just have to let yourself notice it." She blinked, slow and deliberate, and I saw a flicker of relief cross her face. Relief that didn't demand a promise. Relief that simply existed because someone was present without expectation. We talked about small things after that. A book she was reading, a song she'd heard on the radio, the way the city smelled after rain. Nothing monumental, nothing forced, just the quiet shaping of familiarity. And yet, I sensed the shift in her, an opening, delicate and fragile, like a flower pushing through the soil after a long winter. When we left, we walked side by side down the narrow street. The conversation had dwindled, replaced by the comfortable cadence of walking together. She didn't cling, she didn't flinch, she just existed beside me, and I beside her, and that mutual quiet was enough to start building trust. By the time she paused to say goodbye, it felt heavier than a simple parting. I reached out, lightly, touching her hand at the wrist. an unspoken acknowledgement that I would be there, without hurry or demand. "See you later?" I asked. She nodded, a hint of a smile returning. "Later." And as she walked away, I realized that this was more than a meeting over coffee. It was the quiet beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. The kind of start that doesn't shout but lingers, persistent and gentle. It started with a call, abrupt and quiet. Natalie's voice, hesitant at first, broke through my morning routine. "Jacob, I need a favor. Can you pick me up?" I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. Some invitations, when extended by someone fragile enough to need help, are less about convenience and more about trust. I said, "Of course," and went straight to her apartment, the city still clinging to fog and early light. When I arrived, she opened the door looking like someone who had spent the night arguing with herself. Her eyes were shadowed, her hair tangled, and she carried an air of urgency that seemed to weigh the air down around her. She murmured a thank you and slipped past me, locking the door behind her. We didn't speak much on the drive. She stared out the window, fingers drumming on the dashboard, a quiet rhythm that mirrored the tension in her jaw. I navigated through the streets, careful, not intrusive, aware that some moments require space rather than chatter. Presence, I realized, is more important than words. At the hospital, she moved quickly, trying to manage everything at once, but her hands shook when she tried to fill out forms. I stepped closer, not to intervene aggressively, but to offer steadiness. I placed my hand lightly on her shoulder. "I've got this," I said. She looked at me, the briefest flicker of relief passing through her eyes, almost guilty, almost amazed that she could let someone else carry a small fraction of her load. We spent the morning moving between rooms, papers, and questions. She apologized for every inconvenience, for every pause, as if she believed her chaos demanded perfection from everyone around her. I told her, quietly, "You don't have to manage it all alone. I'm here." She didn't respond immediately, but I could see it. The tension in her shoulders eased, the tight grip on her notebook loosened, and a small but undeniable trust began to settle. Trust that didn't need to be declared. Trust that was built in small gestures and quiet decisions. On the drive back, she didn't thank me aloud. She didn't have to. Her hand brushed mine briefly when she grabbed her bag, and the look she gave me carried more meaning than any words could. A fragile acknowledgement of presence, of choice, of a silent promise that someone was there simply because they chose to be. When I left, she didn't wave, didn't call after me. She stood at the doorway, a quiet figure against the light from the hallway, and I understood something essential. Connection doesn't need noise. It only needs consistency, a patient presence that proves itself without declaration. And in that moment, I felt the bond growing, subtle but unbreakable, built not on drama or spectacle, but on small, deliberate acts of being there. It was one of those afternoons where the rain fell in steady, unrelenting sheets, turning the streets into rivers of reflected gray. Natalie invited me over, and when I arrived, she was already curled on the sofa, a blanket draped loosely over her knees, her eyes following the rhythm of the rain against the wind. I didn't ask why she had called. I didn't need to. Some invitations carry their own explanation, and this one seemed to be about quiet companionship rather than conversation. I kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the sofa, careful not to crowd her space. She glanced at me, a flicker of gratitude passing through her eyes, and then returned her gaze to the... We didn't speak at first. There was no need. The sound of rain, the occasional distant car, the muted patter on the roof, it all filled the room in a way that words could not. I reached for the blanket, draping it across both of us. Careful, deliberate. She didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. That simple act of proximity was accepted, a quiet acknowledgement that she could let someone else share her space without fear. A film played on the small television, though neither of us paid much attention. She hummed along to the music in one scene, and I allowed a faint smile to escape. It was not a smile meant for her, or even for me, but for the realization that peace could exist in shared silence, that presence could be more meaningful than dialogue. At one point, her head tilted slightly toward me, and I caught the faintest exhale, a sigh that seemed to carry weeks of unspoken tension. I didn't ask if she was all right. I didn't have to. My hand brushed hers lightly, resting just for a moment on the back of the sofa. She didn't move. She just let the contact exist, and in that small allowance, I felt trust deepen. Time became irrelevant. Minutes or hours. I could not tell. I watched her, quiet and unjudged, and felt the subtle weight of vulnerability she carried. I offered no advice, no solutions, only steady, unwavering presence. And gradually, she began to relax, her body leaning just slightly toward mine, her breath evening out, her fingers loosening around the blanket. "Jacob," she said finally, voice soft and almost shy. "I haven't felt this calm in a long time." I nodded, keeping my gaze gentle and steady. "Days like this are for noticing it, for letting it exist without trying to change it." She smiled, just enough to reach her eyes, and leaned back, closer but not touching me, letting the silence and the rain be a shared rhythm between us. And in that quiet, I realized that what began with a single promise on a balcony had grown into something delicate, resilient, and unspoken, an intimacy that didn't demand explanation, only acknowledgement. She surprised me that Saturday morning by sending a text that was equal parts hesitant and daring. "Do you want to go to the book fair with me?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I replied, plain and steady, keeping it simple. When I arrived at her apartment, she was ready. Jacket zipped halfway, a scarf loosely wrapped around her neck. She looked nervous, and I could see her fingers fiddling with the strap of her bag, twisting it in small, repetitive motions. Some part of her seemed to test whether she could allow herself this small act of normalcy, walking through a crowd, sharing a mundane day with someone else. We walked side by side through narrow streets that led to the fair, umbrellas occasionally bumping together as the drizzle persisted. She kept her gaze mostly on the ground, but I noticed the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't watching. There was something fragile in her observation, as if she were measuring whether this companionship could exist without friction or disappointment. At the fair, I watched her wander between stalls, fingers brushing over the spines of books. Occasionally, she would stop, pick one up, read a line, then shake her head and put it down. I stayed nearby, never hovering, letting her explore, letting her decide without interference. When she finally found a small blue-covered book and held it up, her face lighting with a rare, unguarded smile, I said, "That one has your name written all over it." She laughed softly, almost embarrassed. But she purchased it. I noticed how she carried it differently than other things. Carefully, with a sense of reverence, like holding a token of permission to trust someone. We wandered some more, occasionally exchanging small observations, a cover design, an author's name, a familiar quote. Nothing heavy, nothing intimate in words, but the companionship carried weight. The ease of shared space, the quiet validation of presence, spoke louder than any conversation could. On the walk home, she carried the book tightly to her chest, and I could feel her slowly unwinding, letting herself enjoy this uncomplicated day without fear of judgment. It was a simple invitation, a small adventure, but I sensed its significance to her. The trust she allowed me in that moment was quiet but profound. At her door, she paused, letting her fingers linger on the handle as if reluctant to leave the shared space we'd inhabited. "Thank you," she said softly. "Anytime," I replied. And in that one word, the promise lingered. Small acts of care, consistent and patient, were enough to begin something lasting. Natalie asked me to join her for dinner, and I understood from the start that this wasn't just casual hospitality. Her father had a reputation for being exacting, for testing anyone who came near her, and the air of expectation carried a subtle tension that neither of us could ignore. When I arrived, she opened the door with a tight smile, the faintest trace of nerves in her eyes. I nodded to her quietly, letting my presence speak before words could. The walk to the table was deliberate. I followed her lead but kept a steady pace, mindful of the impression I would make without forcing it. Her father greeted me with a careful nod, the kind that weighs a person up in silence before allowing them space to exist. He asked questions, pointedly, about work, life, and intentions, each one precise and subtly loaded. I answered simply, honestly, without embellishment or bravado. There was no need to impress, only to remain steady. Natalie watched from the side, and I could see the tension in her jaw ease slightly as she realized I was not trying to perform or compete. I treated her father with respect, not fear, and that seemed to matter more than any words I could have spoken. During dinner, small moments of connection emerged. I offered to pass the salt, noticed which wine she preferred without asking, and laughed quietly at her father's rare dry humor. Natalie glanced at me once, her eyes softening in gratitude. "I thought he'd drive you away," she whispered under her breath. "He's not deciding anything," I said, letting the words settle gently between us. "And if he tries to, I'll be steady anyway." She smiled, a real one this, the kind that reached her eyes. The meal continued, and the conversation softened. I didn't dominate, I didn't try to charm. I simply existed alongside her, choosing to be a calm, present force in a space that could have been tense and uncomfortable. When the night ended, Natalie walked me to the door. She lingered, and I could feel her vulnerability, the subtle uncertainty that remained despite the evening's apparent normality. I didn't rush her or fill the silence with platitudes. I simply waited, letting her decide the next move in her own time. "Thanks for being here," she said finally, voice low but clear. "Always," I replied, and in that single word, the quiet continuity of choice and presence hung between us. A bond that didn't need declaration, only steady, patient affirmation. We sat together on the park bench, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the path. Natalie pulled out her phone, her fingers hesitating over the screen before she opened a note titled, "Things That Scare Me." "I made a list," she said quietly, almost apologetically. "Not that I expect anyone to read it, but I guess you can." I didn't hesitate. I leaned slightly closer, letting her know without words that I was willing to listen, that this was not a test but a space where she could be seen. She scrolled through slowly, reading the lines aloud. Rejection, being left behind, failure, loneliness. The words were simple, yet heavy, each one carrying a weight I could feel in the way her voice wavered slightly. "You don't have to fix it," she said after the last one, looking at me like she had just lowered a small, fragile gate between us. "I'm not here to fix," I said. "I'm here to stay." Her eyes searched mine, tentative, as if weighing whether I truly meant it. I kept my gaze calm, steady, letting the sincerity in my presence answer for me. There was no pressure, no urgency, just a quiet assurance that she could rely on me, that her fears didn't have to be fought alone. She laughed softly, almost embarrassed. "It feels silly writing it all down, but sometimes seeing it makes it less scary." I nodded. Acknowledging it is the first step. The second is knowing someone stands beside you while it exists. Her lips curved faintly, the tension in her shoulders loosening just enough that she leaned back against the bench. I didn't move closer or touch her. This was about letting her choose the pace. Sometimes, support is silent, almost invisible, yet it carries more weight than any grand gesture. We stayed there for a while, the sounds of the park around us, a dog barking in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of traffic filling the spaces between words. I noticed her breathing evened out, the subtle tremor in her fingers fading. The list, once heavy, became a shared understanding rather than a burden she bore alone. "You really mean that?" she asked after a long pause. "I do," I said softly. "I can't erase the list, but I can choose to be here while you live with it." Her eyes softened, and I knew she believed it. Not entirely, perhaps, but enough to let the weight of fear feel lighter for a moment, and that quiet trust, fragile and tentative, was the beginning of something steady between us. Something that didn't need words to validate itself. It was quiet at first. Too quiet. Natalie hadn't returned my messages for nearly 2 days, and the absence of her voice pressed into the spaces around me like an empty room. I didn't call repeatedly, didn't send a stream of texts. I simply waited, knowing that pressing wouldn't bring her back any faster, and that trust requires space as much as it requires presence. When she finally appeared at my door, her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, her hair pulled into a careless knot, and she carried an air of defeat. She stepped inside without a word, and I closed the door gently behind her, letting silence be our first interaction. "I thought, maybe I should just disappear," she murmured finally, voice brittle, almost foreign. "Maybe it's better if I'm alone before I cause anyone else trouble." I didn't respond immediately. I took her coat from her hands, hung it carefully, and guided her to the sofa, keeping my movements deliberate, unhurried, steady. "You don't have to disappear," I said softly. "Not while I'm here." She sank into the cushions, knees drawn to her chest, and for a long moment, we simply existed in the quiet. No words, no explanations, just presence. And in that stillness, I could feel the tension slowly beginning to release from her, the tight coil of doubt and fear unwinding in small increments. "I don't deserve this," she said, voice shaking slightly. "I don't even know why you stay." "Because I choose to," I replied calmly. "Because being here matters more than needing a reason. Because I want you to know you're not alone." Her lips pressed together, a fragile attempt at composure, and I saw the faintest nod of acknowledgement. She didn't hug me, didn't reach for me. She simply let the words settle, let the assurance exist. That was enough. We spent the afternoon in shared silence. I read quietly while she dozed for a short while on the sofa, the soft rhythm of her breathing steadying own thoughts. When she woke, the weight on her shoulders was lighter, though still present, and she met my gaze without flinching, allowing a tentative connection to linger between us. Before she left, she stood at the door, hesitating. I didn't speak, I just waited. Then she said, "Thank you for staying." "Always," I said, and in that single word, the constancy of choice, the quiet persistence of presence, anchored something vital between us. It was enough to begin again, slowly, without rush, without demand, in the fragile rhythm of two people learning to trust each other completely. We sat by the edge of the lake, the water still and mirror-like, reflecting the soft amber of the late afternoon sun. Natalie had brought a small notebook, and she flipped it open, but didn't write. She just stared at the surface of the water, tracing patterns with her gaze, as if trying to read her own thoughts there. "I still don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, voice low, almost swallowed by. The words trembled on the edge of confession, delicate and hesitant. "You don't need to be," I said, keeping my tone even, calm. You just need to know you can stay if you want. Her eyes met mine, searching for certainty in a place where there was none. I kept my gaze soft, steady, offering what words could not. Presence without expectation, reassurance without force. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders just enough that her fingers relaxed on the notebook. I'm scared, she whispered, voice almost a shadow. Scared that I'll mess it up, that I'll ruin it somehow. I leaned back slightly, letting the space between us hold weight, but not pressure. You can't ruin this, I said. You don't need to be perfect. You only need to be here. The lake stretched out before, unbroken, its surface calm despite the occasional ripple from a light breeze. She watched the movement in silence, her gaze softening as if she could let herself believe my. It wasn't instant, it wasn't a cure, but there was a shift, subtle and undeniable, a moment when fear met quiet reassurance and found balance. I don't want to lose it, she admitted finally, almost too quietly. You won't, I said. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing to let yourself stay. She nodded, not forcefully, not decisively, but enough that I felt her beginning to trust the promise. We didn't speak for a long while after that. We simply watched the lake, feeling the rhythm of time passing slowly and deliberately, the kind of rhythm that makes room for growth without demand, for trust without urgency. By the time the sun began to dip lower, painting the water with streaks of gold and rose, I could see it in her stance, the slightest lean toward the idea that she could belong somewhere without fear. And in that quiet, imperfect acknowledgement, I understood that belonging doesn't require certainty, only the willingness to be present, fully, and without reservation. Natalie arrived with a small bag in her hand, hesitating on the threshold of my apartment, as if measuring whether she was allowed to cross the line between the outside world and this quiet refuge I offered. I didn't rush her, didn't ask her to explain. I simply moved aside and gestured for her to come in, letting the choice exist fully in her hands. She stepped inside, placing the bag carefully on the floor, and looked around, eyes tracing the familiar corners of the space she had seen before but never inhabited so deliberately. The air between us was gentle, not charged, carrying only the subtle weight of shared understanding. You noticed, she said finally, a small smile touching her lips. All the little things I leave behind. I do, I replied quietly, and I hope you keep leaving them. She laughed softly, almost embarrassed, but the sound held relief. Each object she left, books, a scarf, a notebook, was more than a thing. It was a signal of trust, of presence, of the slow unfolding of belonging. I didn't comment on each item. I didn't need to. Noticing quietly, acknowledging without intrusion, that was enough. We spent the evening preparing a simple dinner together. There was no need for grand gestures or forced conversation. The kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of chopping, the clink of dishes, the soft sizzle of food in the pan. She moved around comfortably, tentative, but confident, and I followed a rhythm that matched hers. Steady, unhurried, attentive. At one point, she paused and looked at me, eyes soft and vulnerable, and said, I think I can stay here for a while. Good, I said, letting the words settle. There's always a place here for. The words weren't dramatic. There was no flourish, no sudden confession, only a quiet acknowledgement of choice and constancy. She didn't respond with grand emotion. She simply set down a small dish she had been preparing, nodded, and returned to her task, letting the reality of presence speak louder than any declaration could. By the time the meal was ready, the apartment felt fuller, not with noise, but with the warmth of two people choosing to exist in the same space without fear. And in that small, ordinary evening, the foundation of belonging had quietly taken shape. Natalie didn't need to say more. I didn't need to promise more. The trust, the comfort, and the simple rhythm of shared life were already enough to mark the beginning of something enduring, gentle, and quietly extraordinary.